Chapter 1. The Boy with the Gold Chain. I smelled the rain before it came. That's the thing about Caldwell's lower quarter. The sky gives you about 30 seconds of warning before it decides to drown you. Dark clouds pressing low over the warehouses, the air going thick and electric, and then the street vendors scrambling, plastic tarps snapping like whips. I'd learned to read it the way you learn anything in a place like this. Out of survival, not curiosity. I was 3 blocks from the community shelter when I saw the car. It stopped the way powerful things stop, without hesitation, without concern for the yellow light it slid through, without any acknowledgement that traffic laws applied to it. Black, long, the kind of clean that cost more than some people's rent. It pulled to the curb on Marin Street and simply waited. I wouldn't have noticed, except Mateo was standing right there. Mateo. 9 years old, perpetually scuffed knees, a gap where his left front tooth used to be, was doing what he always did when he thought I wasn't watching. He was running a hustle. Not drugs, nothing like that. He moved stolen candy bars out of his jacket lining for 25 cents apiece, grinning, that gap-toothed grin at anyone who'd slow down long enough to look at him. I'd fought with him about it 6 times in the past month. 6 times he'd nodded like he understood. 6 times he'd gone right back to it. Today, though, he wasn't selling candy. He was standing very still at the edge of the sidewalk, and around his neck, catching what little light the storm clouds hadn't swallowed yet, was a chain. Gold. Heavy-looking, not costume jewelry, not the kind you pulled out of a machine for $2 at a grocery store exit, the kind that had weight and age and story in every link, the kind that did not belong on a 9-year-old boy in the lower quarter. I started moving faster. The car door opened before I reached him. The man who stepped out was tall in a way that reorganized the space around him. Dark coat, no tie, the collar of his shirt open at the throat. His face was the kind of face that made you do a second inventory. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, in the way a blade is beautiful, but because something in it refused to be casually read. Shark jaw. Eyes the color of storm water. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't loud. He just walked directly toward Mateo with the quiet certainty of someone who had never once, in his entire life, been told no, and believed it. My heartbeat skipped twice and then started running. Mateo. I said his name like a leash, but he didn't hear me over the rising wind. The man crouched down. Not loomed. Not grabbed. He crouched, bringing himself to Mateo's eye level in a single smooth motion, forearms resting on his knees, and he said something I couldn't hear yet. Mateo went rigid, the kind of rigid that 9-year-olds go when they know they've done something that can't be undone. I was running now. Hey. My voice came out louder than I planned. Both of them looked up at me, Mateo with relief flooding his small face, the man with an expression so perfectly still it was almost worse than anger. Hey, I said. I put myself between them. Close. Too close. I could smell the rain on his coat now and something under it, cedar, something darker, smoke maybe. And I could see, this near, that his eyes weren't just gray. There were fractures of amber in them, like old glass. Step back from him, I said. He didn't step back. He didn't step anywhere. He just looked at me with those fractured eyes and said, very quietly, "Do you know this boy?" "I do, and whoever you are, whatever you think he has, you can talk to me about it." Something moved in his jaw, a muscle, pulling once like a thought he'd decided against saying. He stood, full height. I refused to step backward, which meant we were closer than any 2 strangers had a right to be. And I was acutely, uncomfortably aware of how large he was and how small I was not being about it. "He's wearing my necklace," the man said. I turned to Mateo. "Where did you get that?" Mateo's mouth opened, closed. His eyes went glassy in the way that meant he was picking which version of the truth was safest. "Found it," he finally said. "In the park. By the fountain. 2 days ago." The man looked at the chain around Mateo's neck with an expression I couldn't fully name. Not rage. Something older than rage. Something that had been sitting quietly in his chest for a long time before this moment. "That necklace," he said, still quiet. has been missing for 4 years. The first fat drops of rain started to fall. I don't care if it's been missing for 40, I said. You don't approach a child on a street corner. You don't pull up in a car like Nadia. Mateo's voice cracked on my name. I looked down. He was pointing past me. At the black car, at the second door that had opened while I'd been talking, at the man standing beside it with his hand visible and his jacket open in a very deliberate, very specific way. I understood what I was looking at. I understood with sudden cold clarity exactly what kind of man I had just put myself in front of. The tall man with the fractured eyes spoke from behind me, low and unhurried. I think, he said, you should come with me. Chapter 2. What Lives Beneath Still Water. I didn't go with him, not right away. That's the thing people get wrong about moments like that. They assume fear moves fast, that it grabs you and carries you before you can think, but real fear, the kind that knows its own name, moves slow. It settles into your joints, it makes you very, very still. So I stood in the rain, which had graduated quickly from fat, warning drops to something serious and cold, and I looked at the man beside the car with his jacket deliberately open, and I calculated. Mateo, 9 years old, gap-toothed. Currently standing behind my left shoulder, making himself as small as he possibly could. Any running I did had to account for him, the tall man, the one who'd crouched, the one who hadn't grabbed, the one whose eyes held fractures of amber, hadn't moved. He was letting me think, which was either a courtesy or a trap, and I didn't know him well enough yet to know which. If you wanted to hurt us, I said carefully, you wouldn't be talking. No, he agreed. I wouldn't. Then what do you want? He reached into his coat. Slowly, I noticed, deliberately, slowly, in the way of someone who understood that sudden movements had consequences. He produced a card and held it out. Plain. Heavy stock. Just a name and a number, no logo, no title, nothing that would mean anything to anyone who didn't already know. Ronan Voss. The rain hit the card the moment I took it. I looked at the name and felt something move through me that I chose, right then, not to examine. The necklace, he said. It belonged to someone I lost. I'm not here to punish a child for finding it. I'm here because whoever lost it, wherever it ended up between 4 years ago and a park fountain in the lower quarter, that path matters to me. I looked at Mateo. Did anyone give that to you? He shook his head. It was just there, in the grass near the drain. Ronan Voss was watching Mateo's face with an attention that was clinical and absolute. He wasn't looking for a lie to punish. He was looking for a thread to pull. Fine, I said. I handed the card back. Tell me where, and I'll meet you. His gaze came back to me and something shifted in it. Not amusement. He didn't strike me as a man who found much amusing. More like recalibration. The adjustment you make when something behaves differently than predicted. I'll send a car at 7, he said. I'll take the bus. The muscle in his jaw moved again. He looked at Mateo. What's your name, kid? Mateo glanced at me. I gave a small nod. Mateo Cruz. You found something valuable, Mateo Cruz, and you wore it instead of selling it. He studied him a moment longer. Keep it tonight. Bring it tomorrow. Then he got back in the car, and it pulled away through the rain-black street without so much as a tire squeal. And I stood there on the sidewalk in the lower quarter holding a card that was already going soft at the edges from the wet, a 9-year-old pressed against my side, the smell of cedar and something darker still faintly present, in the air around where he'd stood. I should have thrown the card away. By 6 the next evening, I'd looked up the name 4 times and found almost nothing. That was the first real thing I understood about Ronan Voss, not the rumors, not the lower quarter whispers that started circulating the moment I made the mistake of mentioning the black car to Elena at the shelter, but the absence itself, clean search results, a scrubbed surface, the particular blankness of someone who can afford to not exist on mine. Elena grabbed my wrist across the break room table. Nadia Voss. She said it like the name had teeth. As in, the Voss family? As in the Port Authority contracts and the Delacourt murders and the... I hear you? Do you? Because you have that face. What face? The one where you've already decided. I hadn't decided anything. I put on my least damaged pair of dark trousers and a black top that didn't look like I'd pulled it off a donation rack, even though I had. And I'd told Matteo to stay with Elena, and I'd taken the bus to the address I'd found by tracing what little digital footprint existed for a company name printed in fine text on the card's reverse side. The building didn't look like what I'd expected. I don't know what I'd expected. Something aggressive, maybe. Something that announced itself. Instead, it was a converted brownstone on a quiet street in the North Quarter. Brass numbers, window boxes that still had last autumn's dead lavender in them, like someone had once wanted it to feel like a home and then stopped halfway through caring. A man at the door looked at me like I was a package delivered to the wrong address and let me in anyway. The interior was dim and warm, wood smoke and old paper, and I was walked, not escorted. There's a difference, but not by much. Down a hallway to a door that stood slightly open. I pushed it the rest of the way. Ronan Voss was standing at a window with his back to me, a glass of something amber in one hand, the other pressed flat against the glass like he was checking whether it was cold. He didn't turn around immediately. "You took the bus," he said. "I told you I would." "Most people," he said quietly, "don't do what they say they'll do." He turned then, and in the low lamplight of that room, I saw what I hadn't caught fully in the rain. The thin scar that ran from the corner of his left eye toward his jaw, old. Healed clean, the kind you stopped noticing you had. He looked at me like I was the second unexpected thing to walk into his life in as many days. "Sit down, Nadia," he said, "and tell me how you know Matteo Cruz." I noticed he'd used my name. I didn't remember giving it to him. Chapter 3. The W.E.th of Gold and Old Grief. I sat, not because he told me to, because the room had a gravity to it. The kind that came from old wood and low light and the specific quality of silence that lives in places where serious things have been said and never fully left. The walls. A leather chair faced his desk, worn at the armrests in two pale patches where hands had gripped it before mine. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at him steadily and did not ask how he knew my name. Showing him that it rattled me felt like a mistake I couldn't afford. "Matteo lives in the building adjacent to the shelter where I work," I said. "His mother she's in a difficult situation. Has been for about 2 years. I look out for him when I can." Ronan Voss moved from the window to the chair behind his desk, but he didn't sit. He set his glass down with a soft, deliberate click and remained standing, one hand resting on the desk's edge, reading me the way I'd seen certain people read rooms, not for decoration, but for exits. "How long have you worked at the shelter?" 3 years. Before that? I kept my expression neutral. That feels like a longer conversation than this is. Something moved in his face. Almost appreciation. He pulled out the chair and sat. Finally, and laced his fingers together on the desk with the particular stillness of a man who'd learned patience the hard way, not born with it, but built it, layer by layer, out of necessity. "The necklace," he said. "I'll tell you what it is because I want you to understand why I need to know where it's been." He opened a desk drawer and placed something on the surface between us, a photograph. Old. The color slightly faded at the edges the way photographs from 15 years ago fade when they've been handled too often. A boy, maybe 12, maybe 13, laughing at something outside the frame, his head thrown back and around his neck. Clear even in the faded print, the chain, the same one currently sitting in a small glass dish on Elena's break room table with Matteo asleep on the couch beside it. "My brother," Ronan said. Just that. No elaboration. He let the words sit between us the way you set down something fragile. I looked at the photograph for a moment longer than was necessary. The boy had his jaw, I noticed, the same sharpness but softer with youth, still unfinished. "He died," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. 4 years ago. He pulled the photograph back and looked at it once before placing it face down in the drawer. "A private ritual." Something he'd done before and would do again. He was wearing that chain the night he disappeared. When we found him, it was gone. I've been looking for it since. The fire in the small grate across the room shifted, wood settling, and the light moved over his face in a way that showed the scar differently. Not ugly, just present, like a mark left by a world that had not been gentle. You think finding where it ended up will tell you something, I said. I think it will tell me everything. The way he said it, quiet, absolute, with a weight under the words that suggested the everything in question was not abstract, made the room feel smaller. I understood suddenly and fully that this was not grief performing itself for my benefit. This was grief that had been converted over 4 years into something functional and cold and extremely purposeful. I understood also that I was sitting across a desk from a man who had access to my name without having been given it, whose employees stood at doors with their jackets open in specific ways, and who had kept a dead brother's photograph in his desk drawer until it went soft at the edges. The danger and the humanity of him existed in the exact same space. That was the most frightening thing. The fountain in Peller Park, I said. That's where Matteo found it, near the northeast drain. He was very still. How long ago was it put there? I asked. That, he said slowly, is what I intend to find out. He reached into a different drawer and produced a second item, which he placed in the center of the desk and slid toward me, an envelope, thick, unsealed. I didn't touch it. I'm not interested in money, I said. It's not money. He nodded at it. Look. I opened it with 2 fingers. Inside was a printed document, shelter letterhead. A funding proposal I recognized because I'd written it myself, 11 months ago, submitted to 6 different municipal grant bodies and rejected by all 6. A red stamp across the top read "Approved." A number at the bottom made me look up at him. That's not a small number, I said. No, you did that tonight. I did it this afternoon when I decided you were going to come. He studied me with those fractured eyes. Before you ask, it's not conditional. The shelter gets it regardless. I'm not buying your cooperation. Then what are you buying? Nothing, he said. I'm correcting something. That shelter should have been funded 3 rejections ago. The committee chair who blocked it has a relationship with my family that I've chosen to leverage. He said it plainly, without apology or performance, stating a fact about a world that operated by rules most people pretended didn't exist. Consider it a side effect. I sat with that for a moment. Then I placed the envelope back on his desk. I'll help you find where the necklace came from, I said, because it's the right thing to do, not because of the funding. He looked at me for a long moment. Keep the envelope, he said finally. The children at your shelter need heat. Winter is 3 weeks out. He wasn't wrong. I picked it back up, and somewhere beneath the leather and wood smoke and the careful architecture of the room, I felt the first small, dangerous thing begin. Not attraction, not yet, not quite, but the precursor to it, that specific awareness of a person that means your body has started paying attention before your mind has given it permission. I folded the envelope and put it in my bag. Same time tomorrow, I said. He looked at me like I was, again the unexpected thing. Yes, he said, chapter forward. Everything that watches I felt the tail on my 3rd block home. Not a feeling in the dramatic sense. Not a prickling at the nape. Not some cinematic instinct announcing itself. More like arithmetic. The same headlights maintaining the same distance through 2 turns that no through traffic had reason to make. A dark sedan, older model, the kind chosen specifically because it dissolved into city streets without signature. I kept walking. The rain had thinned to mist, the kind that didn't fall so much as exist, suspended in the air around the streetlights and soft halos. I counted my steps and thought about what I knew, which was very little, laid out against what I'd just agreed to, which was considerably more than was wise. I turned into a convenience store on a bed street, moved to the back cooler, and stood there with the glass door open and the cold rolling over me until the arithmetic resolved itself. The sedan had not followed me inside. It had parked. It was waiting. I bought a bottle of water I didn't want, texted Elena to keep Matteo close, and slipped out the side exit into the alley. I was not followed the rest of the way home, but the parking space visible from my apartment window held a car that had not been there that morning. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off for 45 minutes before I accepted that sleep was theoretical and made coffee instead. I arrived at the shelter early the next morning with the envelope, a headache, and a decision I hadn't fully examined yet. The funding cleared before noon. Elena screamed, actually screamed, in the break room and then immediately became suspicious. And by 2 in the afternoon, I'd fielded 3 questions from her that I deflected with varying degrees of grace. The 4th one I couldn't deflect. Nadia. She sat across from me with her coffee and her particular brand of quiet that meant she was done with preamble. Is this connected to the man with the car? Yes, and you're going to keep seeing him. I'm helping him find information. It's not what you're making it in your head. She looked at me with the patience of someone who had known me through 3 bad decisions and 2 good ones, and had learned to tell the difference by what I didn't say. Matteo told me he called the necklace pretty, she said, when the man was crouching in front of him. He said the man touched it for a second, and then just stopped, like he couldn't. I wrapped both hands around my own cup. His brother's dead? 4 years. She was quiet for a moment, then, that doesn't make him safe, Nadia. I know. Grief doesn't make dangerous people safe. It just makes them more complicated. I know, I said again. Softer this time. She let it go. That was Elena's particular mercy. She said the thing once, clearly, and then trusted you to carry it. I arrived at the brownstone at 7. Different man at the door tonight. Broader, the kind of quiet that came from professional training rather than temperament. But he let me through the same way, and I walked the same hallway and pushed the same door. Ronan wasn't at the window this time. He was at the far end of the room, standing over a long table that had not been there yesterday, covered in what I could only describe as the physical anatomy of an investigation. Photographs. Maps. Printed documents with sections marked in red. String. Actual red string. Connecting points across a large city grid pinned to a board behind him. He didn't look up immediately. He was studying something, one hand planted on the table, his whole body carrying the focused stillness of a person mid-thought. Close the door, he said. I did. Someone followed you last night, he said. Still not looking up. My pulse moved. You know about that. I know because I had someone watching to make sure you got home. He looked up then, and something in his expression acknowledged how that sounded before I could react to it. Not surveillance. Precaution. I had reason to believe the meeting might attract attention from people who watch my movements. What kind of people? He straightened and looked at me steadily. The kind who would like to know why I'm suddenly interested in a 4-year-old disappearance? He moved to the board and pointed to a name circled in red at the upper left. Does the name Drevko, Shmana, Arik mean anything to you? It didn't. I shook my head. It will. He pulled a photograph from the board. A man, 50s, unremarkable face, the kind of face that was engineered to be unremarkable, and set it on the edge of the table facing me. He runs import operations through the Caldwell port. He and my father were in business together for 11 years. He and my father had a disagreement 4.5 years ago. The timing landed without him having to underline it. You think he had something to do with your brother, I said. I think my brother found out something about what moved through those port operations. I think he told someone he shouldn't have trusted, and I think the necklace ending up in a park drain in the lower quarter, 3 blocks from a warehouse Samarik's company decommissioned 18 months ago is not a coincidence. The room was very quiet. I looked at the map, at the string, at the radius drawn around Pillar Park in red marker. I traced it with my eyes. The warehouse, the park, the drain, the approximate path a chain might travel through city infrastructure over 4 years of rain and runoff. What do you need from me? I said. He picked up a folder and held it out. There's a woman, he said. She ran volunteer intake at a shelter 2 miles from here until 8 months ago. She left suddenly. No forwarding. I think she knew my brother. I think she knew what he knew. He paused. I think she might talk to you in a way she won't talk to anyone who comes from my direction. I took the folder. Inside, a name. A last known address. A photograph of a woman with tired eyes and a careful smile. The kind of smile that had learned to reveal nothing. I recognized the look. I'd worn it myself. In a different life. In a different city. And the car that followed me? I said. Won't be there tonight. His voice was flat. Final. The sound of something having already been handled in ways I probably didn't want detailed. I nodded slowly. I should have asked more questions. I should have established limits, set terms, built walls with clear architectural intention. Instead, I looked at the woman's photograph and thought about the necklace and a boy who laughed at something outside a camera's frame, and I said, I'll find her. Ronan Voss looked at me across a table strung with red thread and old grief. Be careful, he said quietly. Just that. But the way he said it, not as instruction, not as warning, but as something more unguarded than either, stayed with me all the way home. It stayed with me until I fell asleep. And it was still there in the morning. Chapter 5. The Space Bee When Breathing. The woman's name was Petra Valk. Last known address, a fourth-floor walk-up on Kessin Lane, a street that existed in that particular urban purgatory between gentrification and abandonment. One side of the block freshly painted, window boxes with real flowers. The other side boarded storefronts and a mattress propped against a fire hydrant like a monument to giving up. I went alone. That was the agreement I'd made with myself on the bus ride over, turning the folder's contents over in my hands. I would find her, I would talk to her, and I would do it as myself, not as an extension of Ronan Voss, not carrying his weight into a room with a frightened woman who disappeared for reasons I didn't fully know yet. The buzzer panel at her building had 9 names. Valk wasn't one of them. I stood in the thin morning cold and looked at the panel and thought about the tired eyes in the photograph, the careful smile, and what Elena had said about grief not making dangerous people safe. I thought too about the way Ronan had said be careful, unguarded, unplanned, like something that had escaped before he could architect it back into control. I pressed the super's buzzer. A woman answered, voice rough with either sleep or cigarettes or both. I told her I was looking for a friend, described Petra without using her name, described the careful smile specifically. There was a pause long enough to mean something. She moved to the basement unit, the voice said finally. 6 months ago, cheaper. She doesn't answer her door much. Thank you, I said. She buzzed me in without asking anything else. In places like this, people developed an instinct for which strangers were predatory and which were merely lost. I was grateful today to read as the latter. Petra answered on my third knock. She had the door chained, her face in the gap, older than the photograph by more than 8 months, the way stress ages people in jumps rather than increments. She looked at me with eyes that went from wary to guarded so fast I almost missed the transition. Whatever you're selling, she said. I'm not selling anything. I work at the Haverford Community Shelter on Marin Street. I found her name through a volunteer coordination network. Both technically true. I wanted to ask you about your time at St. Mall. Bridget's outreach. The chain stayed on. Why? Because we had a young man come through our doors whose situation reminded me of a case that crossed St. Bridget's a few years back. I thought you might remember him. I have a photograph. I held up the photo of Ronan's brother. Not identifying him, just the image. A young man laughing. I'd removed it from the folder carefully that morning and held it now with deliberate casualness, the way you offer something to a frightened animal. Low. Non-threatening. Visible. The gap in the door went very still. Then the chain came off. She made tea. She didn't drink. And sat across from me at a kitchen table crowded with library books and an ashtray that had been emptied recently, but still smelled of its history. She held the photograph for a long time without speaking, her thumb tracing the air just above it, not quite touching. And I understood I was watching something private and didn't move. Lev, she said finally. His name. I felt it land somewhere quiet inside me. "He came to St. Bridget's about 5 years ago," she said. "Not as a client, as a volunteer. He was not what you'd expect, given where he came from. Gentle, genuinely." She set the photograph down facing up, like she didn't want to put it face down. "He told me things, over months, about what his family moved through the port, what the other family, the Samaric operation, was adding to those shipments without sanction." Her mouth tightened. "Human cargo, not goods." The kitchen went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "He had documentation," she continued, "physical records he'd copied. He had a plan, someone in the Federal Oversight Office he thought he could trust." She looked to her undrunk tea. "3 weeks later he was gone. And 2 days after that, 2 men came to St. Lash, Bridget's asking about him. Very polite, very thorough." "That's when you started disappearing," I said, slowly, carefully. "I moved units, changed my schedule, stopped volunteering." She finally looked up at me with those tired eyes, and I saw beneath the careful surface something that was neither defeated nor naive. "I kept the copies he left with me. I didn't know what to do with them, I still don't. My heart was doing something irregular and persistent." "I might know someone," I began. My phone rang. Ronan. The name on the screen felt like an intrusion. The present walking into a room that held the past with such fragility. I looked at it once and declined. It rang again immediately. Petra watched my face. "That someone?" she said quietly. "Is it his family?" I looked at her. She deserved honesty. His brother. Something shifted in her expression, relief and terror occupying the same breath. "He's been looking. 4 years." She stood, moved to a kitchen drawer. From beneath a folded dish towel, she produced a sealed envelope, thick, slightly soft at the corners from time and handling. She held it out to me. My phone rang a 3rd time, and in the same moment, the building's outer door, audible through Petra's thin walls, opened with a controlled push that was not the casual entry of a resident. Footsteps in the hallway. 2 sets. Measured. Petra heard it too. Her face changed completely. I took the envelope, pocketed my phone, and in one motion stood and moved to her, dropping my voice to almost nothing. "Is there another way out?" She grabbed my wrist instead of answering and pulled me toward the back of the apartment. And the knock at her door, when it came, was exactly as polite as she'd described. Very polite, very thorough. I stopped breathing. And then, the window at the end of the hall opened from the outside, and Ronan Voss folded himself through it with controlled, practiced urgency. Looked at me once, checking, cataloging, some tightly held thing in him visibly releasing when he found me standing, and put one finger to his lips. He'd known. He'd been here the whole time. I didn't know whether to trust that or be furious about it. Standing 3 feet from him in Petra's narrow hallway with a dead man's secrets in my pocket and strangers at the door, I realized with unnerving clarity that there was no longer a version of this I could walk away from cleanly. His hand found my arm in the dark, steadying. Just that. I let it. Chapter 6. What cracks lets in light. We moved through the back of the building in the particular silence of people who understand that sound has consequences. Ronan first. Me behind him, with one hand pressed against the envelope through my coat pocket, feeling its edges the way you'd check a wound, making sure it was still there, still intact. Petra behind me, her breathing controlled in the deliberate way of someone who'd practiced it. The hallway at the building's rear had no light except what leaked under doors. Ronan navigated it without hesitation, which meant he'd walked it before. Today, or on some previous occasion I wasn't meant to know about. That knowledge sat between my shoulders like pressure. We came out through a service exit into an alley that smelled of damp concrete and old iron, and then through a gate that Ronan pushed open with a key that he produced without searching for it. The alley fed into a side street. A car waited, not the long black one. Smaller, gray, deliberately anonymous. A different man at the wheel who didn't turn around or speak. Ronan opened the rear door. He looked at Petra first. "You'll be moved somewhere safe tonight," he said. "No one from my organization will know the location except me. You have my word." Petra studied his face for a long moment. Looking for the brother in it, I thought. Looking for Lev. Whatever she found was enough. She got in. He opened the front passenger door next and looked at me. I got in without discussing it, because the time for discussing it had passed somewhere around the moment he'd come through Petra's window, and we both knew it. He didn't take me back to the brownstone. The car moved north through streets that grew quieter and wider, the architecture shifting from compressed city density to the spare, expensive emptiness of the upper quarter. We pulled through a gate. Stone pillars, no signage. A camera mounted at an angle that suggested several more cameras existed that were not visible, and along a gravel drive to a house that was large in the way of things built before size became a statement. Old money, or money that had learned to imitate old. Inside was warm. Wood smoke again. His signature. And beneath it, something that might have been food. Someone had cooked recently. He led me through a foyer with dark floors and pale walls hung with nothing decorative, nothing personal, the curated blankness of a space where someone slept but did not quite live. He brought me to a kitchen. That surprised me more than anything else had. Not a study, not a formal room, a kitchen, large and slightly worn at the edges in the specific way of kitchens that get used. A knife block with 2 gaps, a coffee maker with a water stain at its base, a bowl of apples on the counter that were nearly past their moment. He filled a glass of water and set it in front of me without asking if I wanted it. I drank half of it before I found words. "You are following me," I said. Not accusatory, quite. Working it out. I was protecting the approach. He leaned against the counter across from me with his arms folded. Jacket gone now. I hadn't noticed when he'd lost it. The shirt beneath, dark, the sleeves pushed to his forearms. When I realized the men watching, Arik had identified Petra's building, I came directly. "You could have called me. You could have called me. You declined twice. Because I was in the middle of..." I stopped. Breathed. "You still should have told me you were there." He looked at the middle distance for a moment. The particular look of a man choosing between the honest answer and the easier one. "You would have behaved differently," he said finally. "If you'd known I was outside the window, the way you spoke to her, the trust you built, it would have had my shadow over it. She needed to talk to you, not to me." It was the right answer. The infuriating thing was that it was genuinely the right answer, and he knew it and I knew it, and we both sat with that. "Her name was Lev," I said quietly. "Your brother." He went very still. "She told me." I watched his face. She said he was gentle, that it wasn't what she'd expected. Ronan looked at the counter. A long moment passed. The kind that has texture to it. Weight, the specific density of grief, being admitted into a room where it wasn't expected to be welcomed. "He was," he said. His voice was different, stripped of its professional architecture. "He was yes, gentle." He stopped. His jaw worked once. He had no business being in my world. He knew it. He stayed anyway. He looked up and something in his eyes had changed in a way I felt physically, somewhere behind my sternum, because he thought he could fix what I couldn't. The kitchen was very quiet. I reached into my coat and placed Petra's envelope on the counter between us. He looked at it. "She kept it," he said, almost to himself. 4 years. I kept my voice soft. "She didn't know who to trust with it." He picked it up slowly, held it with both hands, not opening it, not yet, just holding it, with the specific care of someone receiving something they had stopped believing would ever exist. His head dropped forward slightly, just a fraction, and for the length of 3 full heartbeats he was not the man with the fractured eyes and the open jacket and the red-threaded boards. He was someone who had lost his brother and looked for him anyway and had not yet given up. I made a decision without consultation from the sensible part of myself. I reached across the counter and covered his hands with one of mine. Just that, no words. My hand over his, over the envelope, over 4 years of looking. He didn't move, didn't speak, but after a moment his eyes closed and the breath he released was long and quiet, like something held underwater finally reaching the surface. When he opened his eyes, he looked at my hand on his. "You should be afraid of me," he said. Gentle warning. Honest. "I know," I said. "I didn't move my hand. You should probably be afraid of me too." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The evidence that a smile had once lived there and had not entirely forgotten the way. "Why?" he said. "Because I'm the only person in the last 4 years who's made progress." I lifted my hand, picked up my water glass. "And you know it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he opened the envelope. Chapter 7. The Thing That Breaks Clean. The documents inside were not what either of us expected. I watched Ronan's face as he read. That was where the truth lived. Not in the papers themselves, but in what they did to him. He had a face built for containment, for the kind of controlled neutrality that I imagined had been trained into him over years of rooms where showing anything was a liability. But the documents dismantled it page by page with the quiet efficiency of something that had been waiting 4 years to be read. I watched his jaw set. I watched something move behind his eyes that was not grief and not rage, but some terrible compound of both. The specific anguish of a truth that recontextualizes everything you thought you already knew. He set the last page down on the counter. He didn't speak for a long moment. "What is it?" I said. He turned away from me, moved to the kitchen window, one arm rising to press against the glass the way he'd pressed against the window at the brownstone. That gesture again, checking whether something was solid, whether the surface would hold. Outside was dark. The gravel drive visible under security lights, the gate's stone pillars pale at the edges. "The documentation my brother copied," he said to the glass. "The port shipments. The human cargo." A pause. He names the families involved, the chains of authorization, and one of the signatures on the authorization chain. He stopped. I waited. "Is my father's." The kitchen held that for a moment. The wood smoke and the coffee stain and the bowl of aging apples. All of it suddenly set dressing around a revelation that had its own specific gravity. I thought about what to say, and decided that nothing I could produce would be adequate, so I said nothing and let him have the silence. "Lev knew," Ronan said. His voice was stripped down to something I hadn't heard from him yet. Not the dangerous quiet of dominance, not the architectural control of a man managing perception, the raw register of someone speaking without armor. That's why he went to the federal contact. That's why he didn't tell me first. He turned from the window and looked at me directly, and his eyes held something that cost him to show. He didn't trust what I'd do. Would he have been wrong? The question left my mouth before I could interrogate it. It hung in the air between us, honest and possibly unkind, and I held his gaze and didn't walk it back. He considered it. Really considered it, which I hadn't expected. 4 years ago, he said. No, he probably wouldn't have been wrong. I nodded once. He picked up the documents again, squared them, set them down. The movement of a person who needed to do something with his hands while his mind worked through architecture that had just been fundamentally reconstructed. My father died 14 months ago, he said, natural causes. So the question of what I'd do with this information is academic, with respect to him, but not with respect to Arik. No. His voice resettled into something cooler. Not with respect to Arik. I wrapped both hands around my water glass. The federal contact, the one your brother identified. Do you know if he was ever approached? I've been working that angle for 2 years. The contact, a man named Aurelio Fenn, Oversight Division, retired abruptly 3.5 years ago, full pension, relocated, untraceable through normal channels. He looked at me, until this week. You found him. I found him. He paused. Through a surveillance record I had to trade something considerable to obtain. I didn't ask what he'd traded. The way he said considerable suggested it was a currency I might not want itemized. Then it was moving toward resolution, I said. Before I walked into any of this, the last piece was the necklace. He said it flatly, but beneath the flatness was something deliberate, the sound of a man placing an admission somewhere carefully. I needed to establish the chain of physical evidence, where it had been, who had handled it. Without that, everything else is circumstantial. He looked at me steadily. You gave me the chain. I absorbed this, turned it over, found the edge I was looking for, Ronan. His name in my mouth for the first time. He registered it, something subtle, a fractional shift. When you approached Matteo on that street corner, you already knew the necklace had been found, didn't you? It wasn't a question. He was quiet long enough to confirm it. I had surveillance on the park drain, he said carefully. Periodic footage review. I saw the boy pick it up 2 days prior. Something cold moved through me. Not rage, something more precise than rage. So you already knew where it had been, I said. In the drain. In the park. 3 blocks from the warehouse. My voice was very steady, which was how I knew I was genuinely upset. You didn't need me to tell you that. You didn't need me to find Petra. I needed someone she would open a door for. Don't. I set the glass down. Don't manage the framing. You used Matteo. You used the street corner. You manufactured a reason to approach me specifically. He didn't deny it. That was the thing about him. He didn't reach for comfortable untruths when the uncomfortable one was already visible. He looked at me across the kitchen with an expression that held the particular stillness of a person who knew they'd been caught in something real and had chosen not to insult the other person by pretending otherwise. Yes, he said. Why me? Because I needed someone from the shelter network, someone Petra might trust, someone who… He stopped. Someone who what? A long pause. Someone who was already safe, he said, quietly, as though the admission had a cost. Someone I'd already verified. As a person. The cold in me shifted into something more complicated. You looked into me, I said. Before Matteo, before the street corner. I did. How long before? He held my gaze. 3 weeks. I stood very still in his kitchen with that landing in me, rearranging things. 3 weeks. He'd known my name before Marin Street because he'd known my name for 3 weeks. He'd known the shelter. He'd known Matteo was connected to me. He'd chosen a moment. The necklace, the rain, the deliberate crouch, to make it look like collision when it was, in fact, design. The funding, I said, was always going to happen, he said quickly. That wasn't bait. I want to be clear, you don't get to want anything from me right now. My voice came out soft. That was the worst of it. I couldn't even be loud about this. You built a scenario. You cast me in it without my knowledge and walked me toward a situation with men who had their jackets open in specific ways and toward Petra, who has been hiding from people connected to your world for 4 years, and you did all of it because I stopped, breathed, because you decided I was safe enough to use. The word landed the way I meant it to. He didn't look away from me. He looked, in fact, more directly at me than he had at any point in the last 3 days. Like I'd turned something up to a frequency he could finally hear clearly. I was wrong, he said. Just that. No architecture, no management. Not about you, about the method. I was wrong. The kitchen was very quiet. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. The documents, I said, what you need to do with them, do it. For Lev. I meant that. Whatever else was fractured right now, I meant that entirely. But I need to not be here tonight. He didn't try to stop me. He walked me to the door, not the front, a side entrance where a car was already waiting, which meant he'd arranged it before I'd announced I was leaving, which meant some part of him had known this conversation would end this way. That made it worse, and also quietly better. At the door I stopped, turned back. He was standing in the hallway's warm light with his hands at his sides and Petra's envelope on the table behind him and 4 years of looking on his face. The ghost of a smile, I said, in the kitchen, when I told you to be afraid of me. I held his gaze. Was that real? He looked at me for a long moment. Yes, he said. I left, and I cried on the ride home, which I hadn't done in a long time, and which I told myself was about Lev, and which I knew, honestly, was about considerably more than that. Chapter 8. What Fire Remembers. The shelter burned at 4 a.m. Not the whole building. One wing, the storage and records annex. The room where we kept intake files and donation logs and the ancient computer Elena refused to replace because it still worked and working things deserved loyalty. The fire department contained it in 40 minutes. Nobody was hurt. Mateo had been sleeping on Elena's couch in the main building, which was untouched. But the message was not subtle. I stood on the sidewalk in Marin Street in the clothes I'd thrown on in the dark, watching the last of the smoke rise gray against a sky not yet decided on morning. And I felt the shape of it clearly. This was not accident. This was reply. Someone had seen me at Petra's building, or tracked the car north, or found some other thread I'd pulled without knowing it was attached to something that pulled back. Elena stood beside me with her arms folded and said nothing for a long time. Then, tell me what I need to know. So I told her. Not everything, not the documents, not the details of what Petra had kept for 4 years, not the full architecture of what Ronan was building toward. But enough. Arakuk. The surveillance. The men at Petra's door. The sequence of cause and effect that ended in smoke rising over the annex at 4 a.m. She listened without interrupting. That was Elena's particular strength. She could receive difficult things without letting them reorganize her posture. Mateo, she said, when I finished. He needs to go somewhere off my immediate geography. My sister's, she said immediately. Eastbridge, she has 3 kids. He'll vanish into the noise. She looked at me. And you? I'm going to make a call. Her eyes said several things that her mouth chose not to. He answered on the first ring. No greeting. Just, I know. The fire is a message, I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. They're telling you they've made the connection to me. They're escalating. I'm aware. A pause, and beneath it the sound of movement, footsteps, a door, the ambient texture of a building larger than it sounded from outside. Are you safe? Currently. Nadia. Just my name, but weighted with the particular tone of someone choosing not to say several things in deference to the most essential one. Where are you? Marin Street. In front of what's left of the annex. A silence that lasted exactly long enough for me to understand a decision was being made. Don't move, he said. And then, before I could answer, please. That word from him. In that voice. I registered it somewhere below the practical registers of thought. The boy is safe, he said. He will be within the hour. Good. Another pause. Then, lower. I'm sorry about the shelter. I had people on the approach. They moved faster than anticipated. How fast is this moving? Fast enough that I need to change the plan. He said it quietly. But beneath the quiet was something I hadn't heard from him before. Not quite urgency, but the controlled near cousin of it. The sound of a man who has spent years directing events from a distance, suddenly aware that distance is no longer available. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He came in a different car again, alone this time, which surprised me. No driver, no man at the door, no jacket held open as statement of available force. Just Ronan Voss in dark clothes stepping out of an unremarkable vehicle onto a street that smelled of smoke and wet ash, walking directly to where I stood. He looked at the building first. At the annex, the blackened window frames, the scorch marks climbing the exterior wall. Something moved across his face that I recognized by now. That muscle in his jaw, that internal architecture shifting to accommodate weight. I'll rebuild it, he said, not grandiose. Simply stated the way he stated things that he'd already decided and didn't require agreement on. Then he looked at me. The look lasted only a few seconds but covered considerable distance. Checking, cataloging. The thing he'd done through Petra's window that had undone me a little, looking for confirmation that I was standing. Come with me, he said. Not a request, this time. I want you to understand the distinction. I am asking. Distinction received, I said. Where? Somewhere? RX people won't find in the window of time I need to finish this. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, heading east, then south, the city thinning at its edges, warehouses and low industrial sprawl replacing the compressed human density of the lower quarter. He drove with one hand on the wheel and his eyes moving, mirrors, side glass, the geometry of the route, with the automatic vigilance of someone for whom threat assessment had become the background process of all other thinking. At a red light, he said, "I should have told you from the beginning. I watched the road. Yes, I don't have a clean explanation. I have the actual one if you want it. Tell me." He was quiet a moment. "When I found you researching the shelter network, your file." A pause. "You'd rebuilt something after whatever happened in the city you came from. You'd come here with very little and built something that mattered and protected people smaller than yourself." He glanced at me once, briefly. I told myself I needed someone trustworthy for the approach. That was true. But it was also... He stopped. "Also what?" "I wanted to know if you were real," he said. Quietly, the way the information suggested. The light changed. The car moved. I sat with that and didn't rush to fill it, because some things needed the space they needed. We turned off the main road and down a lane I didn't have a name for, and the building at the end was small and stone and looked like it had been someone's idea of a retreat before retreating became necessary rather than optional. He parked, cut the engine. In the sudden quiet, I could hear both of us breathing. "Arik knows about the documents," I said. "Petra confirmed he killed Lev. You have enough." "Almost." His hands stayed on the wheel. "Fen, the federal contact. He agreed to meet tomorrow morning. Then tomorrow morning it ends, or it gets significantly worse." He said it without drama, which was how I knew he meant it seriously. "If Arik finds out about Fen before the meeting, he'll move tonight," I said, understanding the shape of it. "That's why you came alone. You needed everyone else on coverage." He looked at me. In the dark of the car, his face was half shadow, half the pale ambient light of a night sky over open land, and the scar was visible again, and the fractures in his eyes, and the thing that lived beneath all his controlled architecture, the person his brother had known perhaps, the one who would have been different in a different world. "I am sorry," he said again. "For the method. For putting you in proximity to this without full disclosure." A pause. "For the shelter." I believed him. That was the thing. I'd looked for the performance in him, the way powerful people perform contrition, and I kept not finding it. What I found instead was the uncomfortable authenticity of someone not accustomed to having things to apologize for, attempting it anyway. "I know," I said. He reached into the back seat and produced a blanket, folded, queen, which he placed on the seat between us with a practicality that was somehow more intimate than anything ornate would have been. "It gets cold in there before the heating catches," he said. I picked up the blanket. "You've stayed here before." "A few times." He got out of the car, came around, opened my door before I'd processed he was doing it. Not performance, instinct. The particular instinct of someone raised with a code he partially abandoned and partially couldn't shake. Standing, I was close to him in the cold night air with the smell of old stone and open land, and I looked up at him and said, "When this is finished, I want the truth, all of it, not the managed version." He looked down at me with the full weight of those fractured eyes. "When this is finished," he said, "you'll have it." I walked toward the stone building. He stayed one step behind me the whole way, between me and the dark. Chapter 9. The Cost of Staying. The stone building had 3 rooms, a main space with a fireplace that Ronan had lit within minutes of us arriving. Not fumbling with it, not asking for patience, just the efficient movements of someone who'd done it enough times that his hands knew the sequence without instruction. A small kitchen that held the basics and nothing personal. A single bedroom at the rear whose door I noted and did not open. I took the narrow couch near the fire. He took the chair. We didn't negotiate it. It arrived naturally, the way arrangements do between two people who are being careful with each other for different reasons. Mine being the architecture of self-preservation, his being something I couldn't yet fully name. The fire was loud in the way fires are when everything else is quiet. I had the blanket over my legs and my phone charging from a cord he'd produced from somewhere, and I was looking at the flames and not sleeping, which I suspected he knew, because he wasn't sleeping either. He was in the chair with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and occasionally he checked his phone with the brief efficiency of someone monitoring a situation rather than seeking distraction. Around 2 a.m, I said, "Tell me about him." He didn't ask who. He was 12 years younger than me. He said it to the fire. When he was born, our mother was already not well, so in certain practical ways I was the one who— He stopped, recalibrated. I raised him more than anyone else did, which meant he learned the business by proximity before he was old enough to choose otherwise. But he chose otherwise. He chose to fix it. Something almost like pride moved through his voice, and beneath it the grief that was always there, load-bearing, structural. He thought the way to fix a broken system was from inside it. That if the documentation existed, if the right people saw it. He shook his head slightly. He had a fundamental belief that institutions could be made to function correctly if given the right evidence. You didn't share that belief. I've spent my entire adult life understanding how institutions actually function, he said. They're not broken, they're designed. The outcomes we call failures are frequently the point. He glanced at me briefly. Lev thought I was cynical. I thought he was. Another stop. I thought he was the best thing to come out of our family in 2 generations. I thought he was right in a way I'd stopped letting myself be. The fire shifted. A log settled, sending a brief eruption of sparks upward before the draw took them. He sounds like someone worth finding justice for, I said quietly. Yes, just the one word. But carrying the full weight of 4 years in it, I looked at him across the small lit space and felt the thing that had been building since a kitchen counter and an envelope in his hands beneath mine arrive at something that was no longer preliminary, not attraction in the simple sense. It had never been simple. It was the specific gravity of recognizing someone whose damage had not made them smaller, whose losses had produced not numbness but a kind of scorched clarity. I understood that. From the inside, Nadia. He was looking at me now. The city you came from, what happened there? I considered the question, considered him. A person I trusted used what I built, I said carefully. An organization, something I'd spent 4 years constructing from very little. He used it as a vehicle for things I hadn't sanctioned and wouldn't have. I held his gaze. When I found out, I burned it down myself rather than let it continue. Then I came here. He was very still. You burned it down, he said. Metaphorically, mostly. I let the corner of my mouth move slightly. Some documentation was filed with relevant authorities. Some funding was redirected. Some people lost positions they'd held very comfortably for a long time. And you. I lost everything I'd built, which was the correct price. I paused. And then I built it again. Smaller, more carefully. He looked at me for a long moment with something in his expression that felt like recognition, the specific relief of being understood by someone whose understanding is not theoretical. That's why you wouldn't take the funding as payment, he said. I know what it costs to have something used as currency. Yes. He leaned back in the chair. You do. The fire was lower now, the room warmer for it, the amber light making the stone walls close and the space between us traversable in a way that the brownstone's studied formality never had. He stood, not moving toward me, moving to the fireplace to add another piece of wood, crouching before the grate in the same unconscious motion he'd used on Marin Street before Mateo, that crouching quality of him, the way he made himself smaller when it mattered. I set the blanket aside. I crossed the room. He heard me, stayed crouching but turned his head, and I sat on the hearthstone beside where he crouched, and we were close in the firelight in a way that was unhurried and not theatrical. After tomorrow, I said, when it's over. Yes. I need you to understand that whatever this is, I gestured minimally between us. It doesn't exist in your world. I won't be placed somewhere in the architecture of what you run. I'm not a protected asset. I know what you are, he said quietly. Tell me, He looked at me with the fire between us and something behind his eyes that was neither managed nor performed. The only person, he said, who has walked through the last 4 years of my life and come out the other side of it still looking at me like I might be worth something. The honesty of it arrived without warning and hit without apology. I reached up and touched the scar along his jaw, just the tips of 2 fingers, tracing the healed line from its start to where it ended, slowly, while he stayed perfectly still and let me. You are, I said. He turned his face slightly into my hand, the smallest motion, almost involuntary, the way warmth moves toward warmth without asking permission. Then his hand came up and covered mine, holding it against his face, and we stayed like that in the firelight while the night outside held its cold, and the morning with everything it carried was still several hours away. When he kissed me, it was careful, and then not careful. It was quiet, and then not quiet, and it carried in its entire length the precise emotional weight of 2 people who had survived different catastrophes recognizing each other across the space where certainty used to be. We did not speak for a long time after. We didn't need to. The fire burned down, and the room held us, and the morning was coming with Fen and our Rick and the final accounting of 4 years of loss and looking, and we both knew it. We stayed anyway. Chapter 10. Everything that Remen's morning came, the way it always does, after nights like that. Without ceremony, without regard for what the dark had held. I woke before him. That surprised me somehow. I'd assumed a man who moved through the world with his level of vigilance would surface at the first shift of light, eyes open, already calculating. Instead, he was deeply, quietly asleep in the chair he'd returned to somewhere in the small hours. Not the bedroom, I noticed, which told me something about his particular brand of restraint that I chose to carry carefully rather than examine too soon. I watched him for a moment I wouldn't confess to. The scar was softer in morning light. His face, without its architecture of control, was younger than I'd understood him to be. The grief was still there. Grief doesn't sleep, but it was quieter, like water that had stopped moving. I made coffee in the small kitchen, found 2 cups that matched, which felt like an unreasonable small comfort. When I brought them out, he was awake, sitting forward in the chair with his elbows on his knees, phone already in hand, already receiving the world's requirements. He looked up. I handed him the cup. He took it with both hands and didn't say good morning, which was exactly right. Good morning would have been wrong for who we both were, and what the day was carrying. Instead, he looked at me over the rim for a moment with everything still visible that the night had let out, and then he said, Fen confirmed. 9 o'clock. The location is secure. I sat on the hearthstone with my coffee. And Arkik? My people have been on him since 3 a.m. He's moving, but reactively. He doesn't know about Fen yet. He checked his phone again. We have a window. Then we use it. He looked at me. You're not coming. I know, I said. That surprised him. I saw it. The fractional adjustment of a man prepared for a negotiation that hadn't materialized. I was never going to the Fen meeting, I said. That's yours. What Lev built toward. You carry that across the finish line. Not me. He was quiet for a moment. What will you do? Go back to Marin Street. Start making calls about the annex rebuild. I wrapped both hands around my cup. There are children who need somewhere warm by winter. That's what I do. Something moved through his expression, that recognition again, the fractured amber in his eyes catching the thin morning light. Nadia. He set his cup down, leaned forward. When I looked into you, 3 weeks before the street corner. The reason I kept reading. He paused, choosing the words with care. Most people who've been through what you were through come out of it protecting themselves first. Building walls. You came out of it and immediately started building something for other people. He held my gaze steadily. I needed you to know that I saw that. Before everything else. That was the first thing. I looked at him for a long moment. I know, I said softly. I believe you. He nodded once. The particular nod of someone receiving something they needed without having been certain they'd get it. We drove back toward the city as the morning opened itself over the eastern skyline. Pale gold and cold blue, the industrial outskirts giving way to familiar compressed density. He dropped me 2 blocks from the shelter at my request, because arriving in his car felt like a statement I wasn't ready to make to the neighborhood. At the curb, he looked at me through the open window. "I'll call you," he said, "when it's done." "I'll answer this time," I said. The ghost of the smile, real, as confirmed. He drove away. The call came at 11:47. I was standing in the annex doorway with a clipboard and a contractor Elena had sourced, assessing the structural damage, when my phone rang and I stepped outside into the thin November sunlight and answered. "Fen signed the testimony," Ronan said. His voice was level, but beneath it something had released, a tension I'd become so accustomed to hearing in him that its absence restructured the sound of him entirely. Federal warrant for Arik was filed at 11:15. He was taken into custody 40 minutes ago. I sat down on the shelter's front step. Just sat down, without planning to. Lev's documentation, I said, entered into evidence, attributed correctly. A pause. His name will be attached to it, publicly, the way he wanted. I pressed my free hand flat against the cold concrete step and felt the solidity of it. "Good," I said. "That's Ronan. That's good." "Yes." A longer pause, the kind that had texture. "There's something else. Tell me." "My father's name is in the record. It will be public." He said it evenly, but I knew now what evenness cost him, and I listened beneath it. I'd had time to decide how I feel about that. And Lev deserves the truth more than my father deserves protection from it. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. That's how I feel. I closed my eyes against the pale sunlight. "He'd be glad," I said. "Lev, he'd be glad you're the one who finished it." The silence on the line was full rather than empty. The difference mattered. "Can I see you tonight?" he said. "Not, I'll send a car." Not an arrangement stated as fact. A question, with the genuine uncertainty of outcome that questions require. "Yes," I said. He came to Marin Street. Not the brownstone, not the stone house, not any geography that was his. He came to mine. He stood on the sidewalk outside the shelter in the early dark, with his hands in his coat pockets looking marginally uncertain in a way that sat strangely and beautifully on a man of his particular architecture. And I came down the front steps and stopped 1 step above him, so we were level. Mateo was back. Elena had brought him home that afternoon, and he'd spent 20 minutes showing Ronan's photograph on my phone to anyone who'd look, announcing that he personally knew that man, and did they want to hear about it? He was inside now, eating Elena's rice, gap-toothed and loud and entirely unaware that the chain around his neck had moved 4 people through fire and grief, and 4 years of looking to arrive at this specific evening. "The necklace," I said to Ronan. "Mateo." "He can keep it," Ronan said, without hesitation. "Lev would have." He paused. Tried again. Lev collected strays. He'd have liked the kid. Something in my chest shifted and settled. "I owe you an honest account of several things," he said. "You said you wanted all of it, the full truth, not the managed version." "I did say that." "That will take more than one conversation." "I have time," I said. He looked up at me on my step with those fractured eyes and the old scar and the ghost of a smile beginning its slow return to residence. I stepped down. We stood on Marin Street in the cold and the thin gold of the streetlights, and the city moved around us with its full, indifferent noise, and the shelter behind me held its sleeping and its waking and its ongoing ordinary emergency of people needing things. And I thought about a boy who laughed at something outside a camera's frame and wanted to fix what his family had broken, and had not died having failed. Not entirely. Not in the end. I thought about rebuilding. How it was always possible. Ronan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, barely touching. 2 fingers and a brushed-by warmth. And I leaned infinitesimally toward it, the way warmth moves toward warmth. And he saw it, and it meant everything it meant. "Come inside," I said. Elena made rice. He looked briefly startled, which was, I decided, my new favorite thing. "Rice?" he repeated. "It's very good." He looked at the shelter door, at the light coming through its windows, at Mateo's shadow moving behind the glass, enormous and theatrical in the way of 9-year-olds performing the act of existing. He looked at me. "All right," he said. And we went inside, into the warmth and the noise and the ongoing human difficulty of other people's lives, which was where I'd always done my best work, and which was, I understood now, watching him hold a bowl of Elena's rice with both hands like it was the first normal thing he'd touched in 4 years, exactly where he needed to be. The necklace caught the kitchen light around Mateo's neck. Gold. Heavy. Full of story. Found, at last.